Hello, everyone, and welcome to another edition of the Addiction Help Podcast, where we talk about the latest in sports news and entertainment as it pertains to addiction recovery, and mental health. As always, I am your host, Dan Hauser, and as always, with me is Jessica Miller, the editorial director of addictionhelp.com. Jess,
Hello.
this week we decided to tackle, I guess you could say we decided to watch a very powerful, very disturbing documentary on, well, now I guess it's called Max. It used to be called HBO Max, but put
Yeah.
out by HBO. So it was actually a two-part documentary series called The Crime of the Century. We only watched the first one because, as we'll get to in a minute, they're kind of tough to actually get through. So this week's
I
episode,
was
we're going to tackle
I
part
was
one.
unprepared, man. I was
Yeah.
not prepared.
So it was your idea. So behind the curtain here a little bit, Jeff,
Yeah.
it was Jess's idea that we do this. And then I start watching this and Jess hadn't started yet. And I was like, I texted her and I was like, have you started watching this? Like, do you
Yeah,
know what you
Dan is,
just
like,
got us
blowing up my
into?
phone
Like,
like, "Oh
do
my
you
god."
understand what you just did to us?
Uh-huh.
But it was very important, very powerful. I'm glad that you did bring it to my attention because it's something we absolutely need to talk about today.
Yeah.
In case you couldn't tell, I am very fired up about this. We will get to that
I
more in a
know.
minute. But just so listeners know, in case you guys want to follow along with us, or in case you've already seen it, this week's episode we are just going to focus on part one. Part two we will do next week because, like I mentioned, Jess and I kind of need some time now after watching part one to kind of
We gotta
decompress,
chew on
reset,
that. Yeah.
and then we'll get into the second part of this documentary. But so just right off the bat, for those that haven't watched it yet, also, in case you still would like to watch it, spoiler alert, spoiler alert, spoiler alert. Don't
Yeah,
I
go
guess
watch it and come back
I
and
almost want
hang
to say
out.
don't listen to the episode as a whole because we're going to
Right.
talk about it throughout until you've watched it. If you don't want to be spoiled on it, obviously, if you don't mind getting the spoilers, then continue to keep listening. But turn it off now if you have not watched yet and you
Yep.
want to watch before listening to this.
And
We'll
you
give you
should.
three.
It's excellent. Like, it's intense and it's a lot, but it's not like, gruesome or gory or anything like that. It's just like, oh my God. So go watch it now and then come hang out with us when you're done and we'll
Yeah.
talk about it.
So 3, 2, 1. If you haven't already turned us off yet, then you're
You
with
have
us for the
entered
long
the
haul here for the rest of
spoiler
the day.
zone.
Yeah, you are entering the spoiler zone.
This is
Um,
it.
so right out of the gate, this, for the record, some documentaries kind of slowly ease you into the story. This one did
Bro.
not. Right out of the gate, you get cops at a overdose call. Like literally, like it's 5 a.m. Cops are pulling up to this apartment. We've got an overdose. So like literally right out of this thing just whacks you over the top of the head. Literally right out of the gate of it.
Yep. It's gripping. And so they're there and they're testing for fentanyl. And like, just as a quick aside, the reason that I wanted to watch this together is because, we talk a lot on here about, how drugs affect people and how addiction affects people and yada, yada. And so, we've mentioned the opioid epidemic before on the show, but we haven't really gone into detail. And I thought, let's explore that and what that is, but also, with relevance to or with talking about some other media that's been made out there. And, we looked at a couple and this one seemed pretty interesting. It's also HBO. So like quality's there, I don't think we were prepared for how intense this is. I mean, it was good. It was thorough. It was horrifying. And like Dan said, it begins with this, like, here's the reality. This is an opioid epidemic. And it begins with someone has overdosed and they are there testing for for narcotics to see what this person
And they
took.
found fentanyl in it, of course,
And
because
they
that seems to
found
be
fentanyl. Yep.
the thing
And
that
like,
these days. But so each episode is 2 hours or roughly 2 hours. I think this one was 2 hours and 9 minutes. I want to say, I don't remember exactly. Between stopping to take notes and just stopping to like breathe because it's like so intense at times. It took me probably about 3.5 hours to get through the whole thing. But
wow.
in the process of taking notes too. So right out of the gate, after that opening scene where where they're testing for the fentanyl and the cops are wheeling out the dead body, and they go into those opening credits. And I took some notes here. bear with me for a second because in those opening kind of credits, they show all these statistics on different billboards that are supposed to represent, different parts of the
Yes.
country. And so some of these, and once again, bear with me for a second while I pull these up. Since 2000, more than 500,000 Americans have died of an opioid overdose. Every 25 minutes, a baby is born with opioid withdrawal. And the United States government estimates that the cost of opioid abuse, what it costs like the country as a whole, is over $1 trillion. So if this thing didn't smack you over the head enough right out of the gate with the opening scene of those cops, coming to a overdose call, you get those three like boom, boom, boom stats to just extra hammer it home. That's like this thing is a big deal and it's not going away anytime soon.
Um, Speaking in terms of statistics as well, just to kind of, they don't talk about this in this documentary, but to just add to that point, so again, since the year 2000, more than 500,000, that's 500,000 Americans have died from an opioid overdose. But we also have more statistical data about um, during the pandemic. During the pandemic, a lot of people struggled with a lot of substance abuse, and there was such a spike in overdoses, especially opioid overdoses during the pandemic because people were in their homes. There was a lot going on in the world, and so it caused for some people a lot of feelings of depression or
They
hopelessness, and
may
there were a
not have been
lot
able
of
to
reasons. Right?
they may not have been able to continue their mental health treatment as well too, because obviously doctors' offices were closed, and
Things were
while
very up in the air. Yep.
telehealth was becoming a big thing and it was taking over, unfortunately, especially in more rural areas, not everyone has access to high-speed internet in their homes. So
Exactly.
yes, they could have their telehealth treatments were available, but if they didn't have the internet capabilities to be able to do that in their homes, they basically essentially were just left to their own devices without any help mental health wise. And, as we
Yeah.
talked about in so many episodes and we've written about in so many pages, unfortunately, when those struggling mentally are left to their own devices, they tend to turn to drugs and alcohol or find anything that they can to relieve them, get relief. And yeah, when you're stuck in your house and nowhere to go, your options for relief are limited at that point.
Right. And that unfortunately really spiked those numbers for people. Um,
And
so
we mentioned that 500,000 number, and we'll get to it in a little bit too because they touch on it in the documentary, but we talk about it plenty too when we throw out these facts and these numbers. Uh, that's 500,000 people that died. So when you factor in though their friends, their family members, their loved ones, what that opening sequence kind of brought to our attention, and they address it again later on in this first part when they talk to another first responder. Anytime somebody dies of an overdose, and this was something that honestly, I'm glad that they brought up because we talk so much about how it affects the friends and the family and the loved ones and the people that knew this person directly. But what we kind of learned in this documentary and what didn't really occur to me is that every time there's an overdose, that also affects the police that showed up to the house, the EMTs, any of the first
yes,
responders, because they are having to go to a call knowing that they are about to encounter a dead body. And
I want to
so,
talk about
and
that
there
for
was a
a second.
gentleman who was an EMT. I want to say he was in Kentucky. And he said that basically what inspired him to get into it is he was in high school and two kids in his class one day at the same time dropped dead of an overdose. But he said every time he goes to one of these calls, he does wonder how much longer do I want to do this because it really kind of sucks driving to a call knowing that there's a dead body on the other side of that, when I get to that destination. So I think it is important to bring up that 500,000 deaths. While yes, it affects anyone close that knew the person directly, it also affects anyone who comes in contact either directly or indirectly with that deceased body after the fact. Like I said, could be a coroner, could be a doctor, it could be police officer, first responder. And unfortunately, too, not to completely go off the topic here, and I'm sure we'll probably take a deeper dive into this topic, particularly in a later edition of the podcast, in a later episode. But it's unfortunately why we see so much substance abuse and addiction amongst first responders and in that line of work because of the trauma and the PTSD that comes with having to constantly go out to calls like that, knowing that there's a dead body waiting for them when they get there, unfortunately.
Right. And, in this particular EMT talked about how in his small town essentially. It's a very rural area. Opioid abuse had become such a prominent and prevalent issue. And so, the idea that there is this sense of hopelessness, knowing that you're going to a call and that this is just an ongoing issue that your community is suffering with. I mean, I can't imagine what that burden feels like to have to see that same problem again and again and feel powerless to be able to make an impact. Maybe you're there and you go on a call and you're able to revive somebody. And at the same time, gosh, you hope that they get help because we say all the time, you can't get help if you're dead. But if you revive this person, if they make it out okay, there's that wondering, I'm sure too, of like, what happens to them. And I know for me, that would be very emotionally grueling because I have a very hard time sort of separating myself uh from things like that. I always want to know how that person's doing. I at one point in my life looked into getting certified to do therapy for people because I do very genuinely care. I find that I connect with people well, that I'm able to explain things that people are able to relate to pretty well. And yet I realized like I can't turn that off. That part of my brain. I would worry so much. So I can only imagine what this gentleman you know, was going through, and I'm sure he represents a lot of people in that field. And I just can't imagine, I feel for them.
Yeah, I mean it's one of the things that doesn't get the attention that it deserves, unfortunately, because and to an extent, rightfully so, we spend so much of our time and energy on the person suffering from the addiction and the overdose, but we do talk
As
about
we
it a little bit.
should.
Yeah, no, of course, rightfully so, and we do also bring up and talk about to an extent how their actions or their overdose affects their friends and family members and loved ones and those closest to them. But unfortunately, the side of things that doesn't get the attention it deserves is how it affects those that come in contact. Like I mentioned, the EMTs, the police officers, the doctors at the hospital, or the coroners. Anyone that has to see somebody who and know what happened to them, and unfortunately, like I said, a call or a result of that is we have been seeing an uptick of substance abuse and addiction within that profession, the first responders and EMTs and whatnot.
One
Awkward
thing
transition time, but back in. Oh, sorry, go
I was
for
going
it.
to say one thing I liked about this documentary as well is that it revealed a lot, like you said, about the folks that were dealing with this, like on ground zero, on the front lines. It's not just friends and family. It's not just the addicted individuals. It's doctors, and a lot of these people were the first to raise the alarms about the opioid epidemic. When and that's kind of what this documentary is about. Is these pharmaceutical companies that allegedly to say, I think, allegedly planned a lot of this and orchestrated a lot of this to make a lot of money, fully knowing that opioids were very dangerous and very addictive, and potentially, it appears, lied through their teeth. And these doctors and first responders, like the EMT we mentioned, were some of the first to raise an alarm and say, hey, this seems to be a pretty significant problem. Like, I'm showing up to a lot of houses with people overdosing on Oxycontin, or a lot of even kids getting
Their
into
own,
these,
we'll get into this. We'll get into this more in a
yes,
minute too. Their own sales reps were also, raising red flags too, and we'll get
yes,
into that
saying
more
like,
as we continue
I'm
going.
making a ton of money
Yeah,
selling this, but like, I don't know. I loved that guy, by the
he-
way. The
that guy
one
was
that
great. Yeah, we'll get more in a minute, but he was definitely one of my favorites within the story. But so after we get past that kind of smack you over the head
right,
right
like
out of the
welcome
gate
to the
thing,
problem.
yeah,
Yeah.
welcome to the party thing. The documentary then does do a great job. They get into the history of opiates and opium, and then eventually how they developed into opioids as we know them today.
Which I
Going,
really appreciated. Did you like that part? I really
I
liked
thought it
that
was
part.
great, and I thought it was interesting that because I think to a lot of us, myself included, and I feel like, our time frame as far as when we kind of got into the industry is around that same time frame. So I, I don't, I speak for both of us, but if I'm speaking out of turn, you can let me know. The fact that opium and opioids and any other derivative of the poppy plant have been abused since the ancient Egyptians first discovered it was like, so essentially we have known since the dawn of man that this stuff is bad, and we're just
And
going to
yes,
continue to keep pumping it out.
and I really appreciated that they illustrated that, while we are currently in an opioid epidemic, this problem overall is centuries old. And I think the
Yeah.
reality of that, it's like something that I think growing up, in school, you kind of hear about like, oh, right, the opium trade and there were wars, fought. And it's just something kind of that's already pre-existing. You just think of history, you think of like, oh, right, of course. But to actually really break it down and illustrate how it relates to present day. I think they did that really well. And I
Yeah, no, they
appreciated,
went through the ancient Egyptians, then
yeah,
into China, and then it went into China, and then the
the
British
wars were fought
trading of it,
over it. People were trying
and
to
then
regulate
obviously
it for years.
in the United States, when it was first introduced in the United States, it was actually during uh, uh this Civil War. It was during a war that was going on because it was essentially used for mothers who were on their own because their husbands were out fighting to basically be able to drug their
World
kids
War
to
One,
sleep so their kids would sleep all day so they could go to
laudanum.
work because they had to work because their husbands obviously were off at war.
Yeah, if you've
And
heard of
then,
that old timey medicine laudanum, that's what it is. Is
yeah, yeah.
it's an opiate. It's essentially like morphine. They
So,
literally heroin was a cough medicine. It was cold
yeah.
heroin.
I mean, Coca-Cola, the reason why it's called Coca-Cola is because in the early days, Coca-Cola actually had cocaine in it.
Right.
Just, for anyone who
Right.
didn't know that, it was actually
That's
actual real
real.
Coke
That's
in it.
true.
Yes, yes. The earliest forms of Coca-Cola, it was called Coca-Cola because it had cocaine
The
in it.
coca plant, yeah.
Instead of having caffeine that we know it now, basically they were caffeinating through the use of actual coke. So
But why
that
do
just goes to
that
show
when
you
you
how
can
the
just
life was
drink
back
this?
then. Well, that's that.
For those listening, I held up a Red Bull.
I've made jokes about it in life. Obviously, I don't like to joke about things like that anymore now. What I do, but I used to joke that it was basically like legalized
Liquid,
cocaine,
yeah.
liquid cocaine, because it's so
It's not.
high in energy. But it's not actually. But no, Coca Cola actually in the early days did have actual
Yeah.
cocaine in it. Uh,
Anyway,
so
back
after
to
that,
opioids.
so
Well, one
after that
thing I
kind of
also wanted to
yeah,
mention about the history thing too, I also appreciated that because I did not know. I know that it is extracted from the plant, but they actually like they don't show the process, obviously. So it's not like a DIY how to make your own, opiate.
well they
But
kind of did though, which was
they
interesting.
showed the parts of the plant that
It's being
like,
extracted.
right, this
Yeah.
is what it looks like. And I just think that's so interesting and important too, because it makes something a reality. And, they talked even about, the cultivation of it. And
It's
yeah,
also worth noting too that like the poppy plant, like yes, that is where opium comes from to make opioids and opioids bad. The poppy plant as a whole actually is not a bad thing. So it's not like it's something that's being grown that we could just say, well, let's just eradicate poppy plants and then there's no more opioids anymore. Now, I mean, if you
right. I
think
have a
about
poppy
just
seed bagel, like,
I was gonna say, if you think about just in the sense of food and nutrition and cooking and things we eat, there's so many things that have poppy seeds in them, whether it's a poppy seed bagel and the poppy seeds are sprinkled on the top, or poppy seeds are baked into something or used for so for those that are, saying, well, if we just get rid of poppy plants, then we don't have opioid. Well, yeah, then we also don't have actual value food, essentially, or other important things that poppy plants do actually do that are important and not illegal.
yes, like not illegal.
But so after we get this kind of brief history of the Egyptians and it goes into China and the British trading and all that, then we get introduced to the Sacklers. And anyone listening to this podcast, I'm going to go out on a limb and say you know who the Sacklers are, because if you're listening to a podcast called the Addiction Help Podcast, you probably know enough about the addiction game,
No,
quote unquote, so to say,
I don't
to at
think
least
everybody does.
I think that most people at least know who the Sacklers are because they were in the news and everyone knows about them from the lawsuits and from Oxycontin and whatnot, even if you're not directly taking it or involved in it from an addiction standpoint. I don't know. But anyway, if you didn't already know, the Sacklers were essentially the family that brought on the opioid epidemic. They're the ones that, for the most part, mass produced and mass brought opium and opiates and opioids into the country and mass produced them for your average Joe. And they marketed them as this is just for anyone who has chronic pain in their life, because up until that point, opiates and opium and opioids had only been used for essentially late stage cancer patients that were already dying and were in a lot of pain. And they were giving them these opioids to help relieve the pain. Because even back then, once again, they knew that it was incredibly dangerous and addicting and really bad for you. But for somebody who's already on their deathbed, it doesn't really matter what the side effects or what bad could come from it because they're already dying.
Right.
So what the Sacklers did, they said, hey, we're going to go ahead and take this and we're going to market this to the general population as a whole as oh, you have back pain or your knees bothering
Well,
you
because
or your head hurts, here, take an opioid.
the thing that I think we also need to mention too is they kind of created this culture of anti-pain. So there's just a little history lesson. The Sacklers were three brothers that were, medical doctors. They worked in an asylum for a
Scientists
while,
too. Yeah.
and they, really felt that electroshock therapy as a treatment for mental illness was pretty barbaric. And, in most cases, it is. Now, just
Which, you
as
know
an
what?
aside,
One aside, for as awful human beings as these Sacklers are, that's one thing I will give them credit for is they did honestly try to find a different alternative to electroshock
yes,
therapy because that's super inhumane and awful. So kudos to them on that part. And obviously those three Sacklers were not Sacklers that ended up being the ones directly involved in what came about of the opioids. So I guess I don't want to say the whole family was awful human beings because they kind of did something that at the time was actually for good. But sorry, continue. Didn't mean to cut you off there.
no, it's okay. Well, so they, now I forgot what I was saying.
The
Uh,
electroshock therapy, and they tried
Yes.
to create
So
something for instead of that. Yeah.
electroshock, it does still exist today, and it is much more advanced, much safer, very different than what I'm currently talking about and what the Sackler brothers witnessed they felt was barbaric. So I just want to point that out because, you know, that is still a valid form of therapy. It's much more targeted now. I actually have two different friends, funny enough, that have had that procedure that it was life-changing in a positive way. So just as an aside, I don't want to spread misinformation about genuine treatment, but we're talking back in the 30s when they would just send a bunch of electricity through a person's body and it really sucked. And um, the Sacklers were like, yeah, this seems terrible. They theorized that, and think about this, like this is 100 years ago at this point almost. There's so much that we know now about the brain and the body and how it works. But at the time, we didn't have this understanding and this technology and information. So they
Once again, back
theorized,
then, cocaine was in Coca-Cola. So think
right?
about
We just
how,
didn't
just as
know.
far as like things that we didn't know about or just didn't have a comprehension of how, like, to say to somebody now today, cocaine was in Coca-Cola is like mind blowing. But back then, it was normal. It was normal to give a child morphine to go to sleep so the mom could go to work. It was normal for
Right.
Quaaludes to be popped like they were candy. It's just, so you think about how things were back then compared to how they are now.
I forgot what I was going to say.
Sorry, I keep doing this. You were talking about the evolution and how we've come as far as knowing electroshock therapy
Well, because you're
was
so fired up, which I love. And Dan was texting me after watching it, like, bro, have you watched this? Oh my God. Oh my God. And
there was
I
definitely some
almost,
there was also definitely some choice words about some of these people that can't be said on this
yes,
podcast. But you were talking about how electroshock therapy back then was just they were doing it so frequently and it was so bad because they didn't know
yes.
better.
Okay. I remember what I was going to say. So the Sacklers basically theorized that, they felt that a lot of mental illness issues were due to chemical imbalances in the brain, which we do understand in a lot of cases is actually true. So they theorized, what if because we use medication, chemicals to shift other things in the body to take from, to change disease, to make things regulate themselves. And they theorize, well, the brain essentially is the same way, perhaps. Now we know that that is pretty true. But so they figured, they theorized again that there was nothing that couldn't be solved by a pill. And so they sort of established this culture in the health industry of take a pill, solve a problem. And it really genuinely seems to me that it started out as a very altruistic, scientific sort of endeavor. And obviously it changed the entire scope of the health industry. They bought a little pharmacy. They bought something else, and I mean, like, watch the doc. I don't want to explain
So they
literally
so they
everything,
bought
but
they bought Purdue Pharma, but
exactly, and
with it,
that's
back then
where that comes
it was
from.
called Purdue Franklin, and then obviously over the decades they shortened it to Purdue Pharma. So they bought this Purdue Franklin, uh, 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 I'm sorry, Purdue Frederick. 1952, they bought a small pharmaceutical company. See, I got to look back at my notes. 1952 called Purdue Frederick would later become Purdue Pharma. At the same time, Arthur Sackler, who was one of the three brothers, he was the one that we came to find out was the much more evil one, I guess you could say, him, because he was the one that was like, we created this great thing, but now let's just go ahead and try to make as much money off of it. Who cares what happens to
Yes,
people? And
it's
so
it's
what
like
he
there's
did,
some shift somewhere that happened. It
well,
seems like because it started out
it was at the
seemingly
same time.
fantastic.
So the brothers bought this medical small pharmaceutical company, and then Arthur Sackler decided at the same time that he was going to buy a medical advertising agency so that he could advertise this to the masses. And that was essentially when, in a weird way, because the opioid epidemic as we know it's basically only been in existence since 98, 99, I would say. But if
Yeah,
you
like
really
the
want to get
90s.
technical with it, the opioid epidemic basically started the day that Arthur Sackler bought that advertising agency,
And yep,
because
and it's
he
been
bought
like
that with the
in
goal
progress.
he bought that with the plan and the goal of making as much money as humanly possible off of these opioids, and it not really caring what the end result was, as we come to learn later, and they talk much more about in the documentary. In fact, he even went as so far, and we're fast forwarding here a little bit now, but he even went so far as to pay off a member of the FDA to sit and meet with him to
Huh?
cultivate and create their FDA application. And so by hiring this FDA guy to help him write this, he knew that this guy would be able to help him write this application in a way that there'd be no chance that the FDA would not approve this.
Yeah, so
So
let's explain that
inside
for a
job,
second.
basically.
So in any medication that you take, there's always this package insert that explains stuff that basically is illustrating, yes, we, the FDA, the US Food and Drug Administration, a bunch of scientists, professionals have looked at the contents of this consumable. So it's not just drugs. The FDA looks at food and things like that too, regulates that process. We have deemed it safe for the American public. And so they, the Sacklers, are, we'll just say from now on, Purdue Pharma, because really there were more people involved at this point. Like the higher ups, the what are they called? The
The fellow
executive.
C-suiters, beyond just the Sacklers
Yeah,
who
yeah,
owned it.
yeah,
You had
yeah,
the
yeah. So
everyone was on board on this, as you learn in the
yes,
documentary, from top to bottom.
yes.
Everyone was turning the other way in exchange for the large sums of money they were making off this stuff.
So basically, Purdue Pharma, that they found someone at the FDA, I guess, that was easily manipulated, and and were involved in the process of writing what would come in the pamphlet by the FDA. And it included this key line about essentially, it is believed, it's very, very, very absolute cunning language. It is believed that this medication essentially is not addictive. That's the gist of what it says. And so that comes in the pamphlet, thus allowing them to market this medication to physicians who were hesitant, understandably, to overprescribe to their patients, to market it as, well, listen, it says it right here. The FDA approved this. This is scrutinized. So, if the FDA said that it's unlikely, it is believed to be unlikely to lead to addiction, I mean, really, it's very safe. And essentially, that was a lie. And it's just like, it's just mind blowing
I
to me.
think they went so far as, if I remember correctly, I think they went so far as to say that like less than 1% of people will actually become addicted to
Yes.
this product.
Yes. Other facts
Which,
that they
yeah,
spat out was that if you are, and I want to mention this because I literally saw this about a month ago. I'm not calling anybody out, but I saw this on Facebook where somebody was dealing with tooth pain, and a person who I don't know personally, but evidently is in the medical field, not a doctor, but in the medical field, parroted this line that is false that was touted at that time. They said, well, if you are in pain and using it for pain, you cannot become addicted. That is something that was taught to and shared throughout the medical community at this time so that Purdue Pharma could get as many sales of this medication as possible. And one of the lies that they spread was, well, if you're in pain and you're taking it, it just the way your brain works, you cannot become addicted. And that is 100% false. And what's
And we
mind
actually ended
blowing
up
to me is I just saw someone comment that same line about a month ago. And it's like, in the midst of the opioid epidemic, knowing all of this stuff is false, knowing that, a lot of people are misled, yada yada, people are still parroting those mistruths. That to me is terrifying. So
and Purdue Pharma actually invented a word to define what you just described, and we learned about it in the documentary, and it's called pseudo addiction. And pseudo addiction is the concept that a person wasn't actually addicted to the drug; they were addicted to getting rid of the pain. And
right.
so, what Purdue Pharma and all these doctors and all these people were saying is that, hey, these people may show signs of addiction, but they're not actually addicted. And in reality, sorry, I'm looking at the notes here. In reality, what they're doing is they're just going about relieving their pain in any means necessary. So
Yes.
whatever they
So
needed to do to get rid of their pain is what they were going to do. However, no, what it was actually happening is they were developing an addiction to oxycontin or any other opioid. But in order for these doctors and Purdue and these other entities that had financial, I guess you could say, they needed this to continue to succeed. Their justification or excuse of it was to say, no, they're not actually addicted. They're just doing whatever they need to do to relieve themselves of their pain.
yes,
It's interesting too that you mentioned about the lengths that they would go to get the public on board, get doctors on board to prescribe them, get everyone on board. Um, we learned in this documentary too that part of the advertising campaigns that were done in the early days by Arthur Sackler when it was still Purdue Franklin, he would take out these advertisements in local newspapers throughout the country, and in the ad it would be just business cards of doctors from all over the country, uh,
that's
basically
right.
saying like all these doctors, prescribe OxyContin or they prescribe opioids and for their patients, and it's great and it helps their patients out. And, nothing bad's happening, whatnot. And we come to find out that the all those doctors' business cards in those newspapers were fake. They were made up names, they were
Fabricated.
made up
Yep.
addresses, they were made up phone numbers. Those doctors did not actually exist. So
Yes.
from the very, very, very beginning,
Very misleading.
Purdue Pharma was essentially tricking the general public into thinking something was highly dangerous was totally okay.
Here's something else I wanted to talk about. I want to talk about the pain thing. So, I don't know if you guys have been to, hospital or something, but one of the things that they assess you for is your level of pain. And they show you that pain scale. There's those weird faces. Where do you think that came? Because we haven't always done that. It used to be, and they do go into much more detail. I'm just going to touch on the surface of this for now. But this phenomena that pain is absolutely unacceptable is relatively new. Where do you think that came from and why? And
And
it's
it's talked about in this part one as well too. It's addressed about how all of a sudden one day it wasn't okay to be in pain anymore, and where did it come from basically.
yes. And the entire thing is, part of this marketing campaign was Purdue Pharma and representatives therein basically saying to these medical professionals, well, really, when you triage a patient, you should also be assessing their pain. Pain is a problem. And it used to be believed in the medical community that pain was actually beneficial. Now, we know this isn't necessarily true, but they even believed before we had anesthesia and such during surgeries that if the individual was experiencing pain, the, cortisol levels and the heart rate and the blood flow, all of those processes that happen when you're in pain were supposed to promote healing. And so, there were doctors that were very resistant to treating pain, or there wasn't this sensationalism around like, oh my God, are you in pain? Take a medication, take a pill, take a pill. That whole culture, if it seems like it's relatively newish, that's because it is. And it was pretty much fabricated and spread by Purdue Pharma. Now, that's not to say like
The
pain
adage
doesn't
of what
suck,
doesn't
but
the adage of what doesn't kill you makes you stronger basically
yes,
is comes from that time period
yes,
pre opioids and even pre anesthetic based on, with what you were describing there as far as the way doctors treated
exactly.
their patients.
And the whole idea of a pain scale, it's like basically Purdue Pharma created a problem because they just so happened to have the perfect solution, and it was these opiates. And that to me is also just so thought out and sinister because, doctors have treated pain, in the past, but instead of like, take a Tylenol, take an ibuprofen, or, take something like morphine for end of life care, it became this issue that they pretended was this real problem that, oh, millions of Americans are in pain and it's not being treated properly. And, we have the solution. Like doctors should be, treating this pain. And like one doctor that's on there, actually a psychiatrist, talks a lot more at length. So, watch this so you can see what she has to say. She says it not, but she explains that, this whole like this culture of, oh, treating pain, you know, all of these people are being untreated and being, left in pain. It's just this like, not rumor, but just like this, I don't know, attitude at the time that there was almost this level of shame placed on doctors that, well, if you're not treating your patients for pain and doing it, effectively, you're a terrible doctor. If you're not prescribing pain medication, you're a terrible doctor. And so it's like this entire snowball effect that it's just, to me, it's so multi-layered and so sinister. That's when I wanted to text you, but it was kind of late at that point that I wanted to be like, Dan, like, oh my God. Oh my God.
Well, and fast forwarding a little bit into this part one or whatever, um, it it reached a point with Purdue where they accomplished their goal, obviously, and everyone and their mother was now prescribing and taking opioids, so they were having trouble keeping up with the demand. So
Yeah.
enter then
Yeah.
it then in enters, and I didn't know about this. Then in enters J&J, who Johnson and Johnson, who most people associate Johnson and Johnson with, baby shampoo and baby
Yes.
formula and those cute little baby
Wholesome, like
commercials. Yeah,
family talcum powder. Yeah.
exactly. But they're
I didn't know
also
this either.
so I did know that they were a medical company. I think a lot of us
Yes.
learned for the first time that J&J was a medical company during COVID because they
Yes.
were the other brand. It was Pfizer and J&J were the ones that were
And Moderna.
mass producing the COVID vaccine. So for me, like that during COVID was when I was like, wait a minute, I thought Johnson and Johnson, that's the baby company. But anyway, so
Yes.
we learned though
Good
during this
marketing.
documentary that J&J has been in the medical industry long before the COVID vaccine because what ended up happening was Purdue ended up reaching out to them because they had access to hundreds of acres of land of poppy plants pardon, forgive me a second, I have to check
Tasmania.
my note. Tasmania, thank you, Tasmania. And so between them and Purdue Pharma, they were essentially going to different areas of Tasmania, and I want to say it was $100,000 bribes. They were well, not bribes. They were basically paying farmers $100,000 to convert their farmland from corn and other crops to poppy plants,
Yes, and
so that they could then
they were offering prizes of, like, new
yes,
cars, like
yes,
Mercedes and stuff for the most productive, and so imagine
yes,
you're just a regular farmer making a living.
in
It is obviously not
Tanzania
a
of all
right.
places.
It's not a glamorous job, and you find out, one of the local farmers, like, "Oh my god, you can win a brand new Mercedes for," so it wasn't just for having these crops, it was for producing the
Also,
most. So
I
it
mean,
put them in competition with one another to produce and produce and produce.
we also think about that part of the world, and I'm not saying that I say this flatly, but it is what it is. To certain people in that part of the world, $100,000
It's
of
life-changing money.
American
I mean, that
money,
is for anybody.
But
yeah,
especially in some of
yeah,
those parts of the world, you come and say, "Here's $100,000 US," like,
yep,
your
that
family's set for life, basically, at that point.
yep,
So
and they
how are you to
absolutely knew
turn that
that.
down?
Exactly, and they absolutely took advantage of that and knew that. I yeah.
So, just because we're already kinda reaching that point
I
where
know, I
we're
wanted
the end of
before we close, I wanna
Yeah,
talk
so just
about that lady.
one quick point. Yeah, so one quick point I wanna make, and then we'll get into our kind of our last wrap-up thoughts. For those of you that thought to yourselves or listening to this, "Yeah, well, I'm sure the government got them and they're all sitting in jail now." No. So this company that's worth over, I think what they say, $10 billion or something like
Yep,
that,
yep.
um, it were required to pay $600 million in fines, and that was it. No, not a single person went to jail. They didn't even have to stop making it. In case you haven't noticed, OxyContin is still available on the street and in pharmacies and in doctors' offices around this country. So their punishment was that they made $10 billion, and for that they had to pay $600 million back, which a
Those are
gentleman
all
even
large
said in
numbers, but that's a drop in the bucket is what that
for
really
yeah,
equates to.
what and a gentleman in the documentary put it perfectly. He goes, what this is telling now other drug manufacturers is that you can make something that you know is going to kill people, make $10 billion, and the worst thing that's going to happen to you is you're going to have to give a couple hundred million of it back in fines. What company wouldn't basically take that, trade off essentially? And
Yes, it
so
they
it's
paid
true.
the speeding ticket is
Yeah.
what some
Yeah.
people said. It's like
Yeah.
certain for the very wealthy, fines are not a real punishment because, like, that's just they can pay that very easily and continue making money hand over fist off of the backs and blood of people that they're harming.
Absolutely. And so just to wrap it up really quick, because we got a lot of our thoughts in during it, but there's one thing we
We
didn't
did.
touch on, Jess, and I know you were very vocal on it. I was very vocal on it. I said a lot of words and text to you that we can't say on this
Yeah, we
podcast
try to keep
about,
our language
yeah.
clean here.
I said a lot of words to you in private via text about this one particular gentleman that can't be said on this podcast because we are a family show after all. And that was Dr. Lynn Webster of Lifetree. And so I'll
Garbage,
let you
garbage.
start if you'd like to share your thoughts on him, and then I'll kind of throw in my stuff at the very end. But yeah, this gentleman, um,
He's
I
got
can't
blood
even
on
think
his
of a,
hands. He's got blood on his
I
hands.
can't even think of a word to say that would be appropriate for this show. But he's a really awful human being who shows zero remorse for his actions.
He's a garbage doo-doo man,
Yeah,
we'll say.
shows zero remorse for his actions, and basically said he would have done it all over again if he could.
Yep. So just to summarize, we also, among the people that are interviewed is an older gentleman who is the husband. He is a widower, the husband of a woman who had a car accident. She had screws in her neck, so she was, dealing with a lot of constant pain. But she eventually got to a point where she was managing it well. Well, long story short, somebody recommended, well, go see this doctor, Dr. Webster, at his pain clinic. And, he'll make things even easier and better for you. And so she went and again, watched the documentary. But long story short, she died. And the process of that happening was she was on so many different medications that, she was like passing out, like nodding off, like, an addict would. And the husband, would tell her and she didn't believe him. So he actually took pictures of her to show her, not to shame her, but to show her that, like, honey,
This was
something's
happening. Yeah,
wrong. And we actually got to see some of those pictures in the documentary. I mean, it's horrifying. And she just, slumped over, passed out. And so, they went to the ER and the ER doc basically said, this regimen is going to kill her. Like, this is awful. This is why she's having all these issues. She,
she was
weaned
on enough
herself off of
painkillers
all
to
of it,
basically kill a
like
horse.
trank an
Essentially, when they went
elephant.
through, it was just
Yeah,
ridiculous. It was like 10 different types,
right.
all very high doses. Like it was just insanity,
And it just a
insanity.
cocktail of things. So
Yeah,
she came off all of it and was doing very well. And her husband said, she was managing her pain actually really successfully with Tylenol. And then at some point, she was back at her physician's office, Dr. Webster, and he basically said, I'm her doctor. I know what's best for her. End of discussion. And put her back on all of those medications, kept
quite
upping the
literally shoved
dosage,
those pills down her throat.
and she died. She died of an overdose.
And we
And
and then we come to learn too that was it? I think they said what was it? Close to 100 of his patients ended up
A
dying of
lot.
overdoses. And
Yes.
and and as we
And
learned
his
from a lot of
yep,
the interviews, it's like one or two people die in your practice as a result of an overdose. That's a
of
major
a result of
problem.
your treatment,
And
right?
that's
Like,
enough to get you basically like your medical license, like, taken away. And this
well,
guy,
the medical examiner reported
yeah,
his office
yeah. And then
to the
he ended
medical
up getting
board.
raided by the FBI. And so obviously he's no longer practicing, but as he puts it, it's not because he doesn't want to, it's because his reputation took such a bad hit that he can't practice anymore. And he wished that he could because he would go and do everything the same way he had been doing it, which is why I
Yes.
say he's such a garbage human being because he literally shows zero remorse.
His
Um,
defense is that, well, despite the fact that he was making tons and tons of money, his defense was, well, my patients are all, dealing with severe pain. And for many of them, the reality is, they are likely to commit suicide. And so, of course, there's the risk of having them become, addicted or deal with an overdose as a result of their treatment regimen. But what's worse, that potential risk or them being so miserable that they want to kill themselves. And like to the husband's, like that sounds like a good argument, but to the husband's point, like that was not the case for this woman. And who knows how many others were exactly like that, where this doctor is touting this kind of exaggerated story of, well, if they're not taking the medication, I say they're going to kill themselves. Like, man, it's really sinister and sick.
And we'll
It
tease
is.
you guys with this one for those who maybe not haven't watched it yet and they've stuck with us through this whole episode, or even for those that did. Just a little reminder out the door because we're running out of time.
I know.
We didn't even get into the guy who was basically being used as a guinea pig because he was a former
Bro.
heroin addict. So they knew that he could
Right.
take just like obscenely high doses and nothing would happen to them. So they could then go to doctors and say, see, you can give people 160 milligrams of this and nothing that'll happen to
That's
them.
fine. We
But
did it
they,
with this guy.
yeah,
Uh-huh.
but they did it with that guy specifically because they knew that he had been formerly a heroin addict and that his tolerance level was so high that there was not a dosage amount could be given to him that would hurt him. So
Yes.
we didn't even get in. We didn't
We'll
even get a
talk
chance to
about
talk
that
about him.
next time when
Yeah,
we watch
we'll
part
we'll
two.
when we get into part two, we'll recap part one and we'll bring that up a little bit more. But yeah,
Yeah. Oh,
that
yeah.
isn't enough to get you to watch this if you haven't already. A human guinea pig, and I don't know what more is.
Yep.
Um, but
It
it is
truly is the
important to
crime of the century.
yeah, well, and that's the name of the documentary, and it's a fitting name at that. Um, Also, I think that if this documentary taught us anything as well, too, it's that obviously, if you are not okay, if you need help, please go seek out help. Obviously, seek out proper help. Don't go to one of these Purdue doctors that's on the payroll. But seek out help. Obviously, the underlying theme of this too is that there is a lot of opioid abuse, and it does result in a lot of opioid overdoses and deaths that are not related to being prescribed the medications. People do obviously abuse them recreationally as well, and like I said, that's kind of how the whole documentary started. So please,
And
if you
yeah, that you can become addicted even
yeah,
if you're following your doctor's directions. Not every doctor is evil like Dr. Webster, but like to Dan's point, if you feel like you're not okay, please bring that up to your doctor.
please go
If
get help.
you're
Yes,
very uncomfortable, get a second opinion. Like
I was gonna say
you
if you
don't
don't feel
deserve to
yeah,
suffer.
if you feel that your doctor is not going to listen to you, or you feel that they're going to keep just pushing more pills on you, there are so many other people out there that can help you, whether it's a psychiatrist, psychologist,
Right. Listen to
treatment
your
professionals,
body.
mental health
Yes.
professionals. There are so many people that want to help you out there. So please, um, go get help when you need it. If you need to, if you're not sure where to begin, there are some great options out there for you. Findtreatment.gov is a great place to find treatment options in your area. The Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration has a toll free hotline 24/7, and that number is 1 800 662 4357. That's 1 800 662 4357. There is somebody on the other end of the line. You will not have to hit 19 numbers to to talk to somebody. Someone will answer, someone will talk to you right away, someone will help you with anything you need as well. And of course, obviously, we encourage everyone to go and check out Addiction Help and addictionhelp.com.
We got a
Jess
lot of
and the writing
info on
team
there for
over
you guys
there,
to read.
there's a lot of stuff for Jess and the full writing team over there does on a daily basis. They're putting out great content, very valuable content. If you want more information about opioids specifically, I know we also didn't get a chance to touch on signs and symptoms of opioid addiction and overdose and what to do in those circumstances. Please go onto the website. Jess has so much great and valuable information about opioids and opioid addiction as well too. But that will do it for us for today. Thank you all for tuning in and listening. Please, as always, like, subscribe, rate, review. Continue to send those questions in. Once again, episode 20, we are going to do another listener Q&A. So please continue to send in all those questions because episode 20 is right around the corner. I think today we're on 18. So only 2 more to go until we get that one. So you're running out of time. So please send in those questions. Thank you all for listening and tuning in this week. And we will talk to you next week. Have a great week, everybody.
Bye. Thanks, guys.
See ya.